Hi, my name's Kelly Gilson, and I'm the Executive Director at United Way Oxford. I invite you to join us on our new Let's Talk Local Oxford series. We'll share everything about United Way Oxford, our work, our partners, our investments, and how everything we do is designed to create positive social change right here at home in Oxford County. Not only do we want to share, but we hope to inspire you to join in our efforts and learn ways in which you too can show your local love. So, let's talk local, Oxford.
Woodstock Libro Credit Union is the proud sponsor of Let's Talk Local Oxford.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Local Oxford. This is our third episode, and we are so excited to be able to share some information about our community here in Oxford County that I think people will find really interesting today. I want to start by thanking Libro Credit Union for their generous sponsorship of our podcast. It's still odd to me to say that we have a podcast, but how cool are we, really? And if I could just quickly reflect back to our last episode, we were joined by Cheryl Micacchi, who is our Community Impact Coordinator, and we discussed the role of our Community Impact Counsel. Those volunteers are absolutely amazing, and they are really critical to the work that we do. And we talked about how United Way Oxford leverages our community knowledge and our public knowledge and the incredible insight of those volunteers to allow us to make meaningful funding decisions to organizations, programs, and services across Oxford County that really help make people's lives better, give them hope and opportunities for a healthier and more stable future. And so today we're going to welcome Cheryl back, and we're going to talk a little more about sort of the follow-up of that piece, and we're going to talk about our community conversations and that work and what we learned through our Harwood training and how we utilize those conversations to really get to know our community and what matters most to the people we serve across the county. So, Cheryl, thank you for coming back for episode number 3.
I'm glad to be here, Kelly.
Well, thank you very much. So, I think maybe to start, we'll just talk a little, we'll start maybe with the Harwood piece on conversations and sort of how they're structured. And then we can talk about, we've been doing them on and off, these conversations, since 2013. And we can talk about why they're different from what I would call what we had done before, that traditional engagement or, traditional surveys or town halls, that kind of thing. And really what people have said and how we theme it. And that to me is just so interesting. So to start, the Harwood Harwood Institute of Public Knowledge has really developed a cool way of engaging with people to learn about their hopes and aspirations through these community conversations. So Cheryl, do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience doing those conversations and why they're so different?
So thanks, Kelly. I think what attracted us to the Harwood approach is it was a way to kind of put your assumptions to the side. You didn't go into any of these conversations with a preconceived idea of what you wanted from them, which I do think is what makes a difference from a town hall meeting, let's say, or a survey, is often, not always, but often those are designed, whether deliberately or not, to really go after some specific information. So they have their place, but we were really looking for something that really got to what people were really thinking and hoping and wanting to have for their community. And as I said, we really didn't want to go in with any preconceived notions on that. So that's really what brought us to the Harwood approach, because it really does start with what seems like a simple, open-ended question, is, think about the community that you would like to live in. What are your aspirations? What would it look like? What would it be like? What would you see in that kind of community? Which is very open-ended. And often when we ask that question, as you know, people sit there very quietly.
Crickets.
Crickets. But I'd like to think it's because nobody's asked them that question before. But people, you can tell people are thinking, what do I want that to look like? And it isn't very long before you start to get answers. And, where people start to say, well, I'd like to live in a place where people feel welcomed. I'd like to live, and it can be that, or it can be something really specific, like I'd like to live in a place where the streets are clean. Like it ranges, whatever you get. So that really open-ended question is what starts a conversation. And what the follow-up is as you listen to these things, and as we note what people are saying, then you start to hear commonalities, and you say, okay, we have sort of the one-off thing over here, and there's another one over here, but there's some common things popping up here. So then you start to ask more questions and say, so what would it take to get to that kind? You've described this as your community, so you paraphrase in some ways. What would it take? And now you get people talking about concrete things. What would it actually take? What kind of actions? What would we need to do? And now you're getting to some real hard and fast realities of the community. So we start with sort of the big thing. Now we're getting down to our particular community. And in the very end, you talk about what gets in the way of this. So what's stopping us, right? If this is what we all want, we sort of described this community, we've said this is what it would take. What's getting in our way? What are the roadblocks? And we start to hear those kinds of things as well. So that's sort of, there are different versions of the Harwood conversation. They can be as simple as those 3 questions. There are some where you can go deeper. There's sort of sub-questions that you can ask, depending on the conversation that you're having. But we try to make them the same with each conversation so that we're not leading any conversations. We're not kind of directing it to where we want it to go. We really do want to hear what people think. I think what you and I have learned out of this is when we go back at the end of all this and we theme these conversations and we say, here's what everybody said. And I think when we talked last time, we said, you could be talking to seniors, you could be talking to youth, you could be talking to the working class, you could be talking to people who live out near Sally Creek. There are themes. So when we go back to those people and say, here's what we heard, did we get it right? You get the nods. We always get that, yeah, that's exactly it. So it affirms.
It does.
Exactly what we heard, because we do want to get it right. We do not want our assumptions, because we have them, to guide any of this. We really do want it to be a reflection of the community.
You really hit the nail on the head, because one of the things that I have really thought about as we went through this journey, and it's been almost a decade now, so it's been a learning journey through the whole thing. But United Way has always said, and truly, believed and did have not community knowledge. I mean, that is one of the important roles that United Way brings to the community they serve, above and beyond the funding and the investments and all of those. But we're a knowledge center. We're a conduit for connecting organizations and individuals to issues and to opportunities. And so we have done all kinds of knowledge gathering through the years. I've been here a long time now, and I know that we've done that. And we could always stand tall and proud and say, we understand our community. But since we switched to this way of working, we understand the community differently. And one of the ahas when we were learning this is historically we would have had those kind of town hall meetings. We would have brought all kinds of people we were connected to together, whether they were elected officials, whether they were staff at organizations, they might be service club folks. I mean, all kinds of people. We would bring them together and we would, have some kinds of dialogue. But the difference, I think, in this is we will go to some of those people, certainly afterwards, with our information. But the information we're gathering through conversations are with everyday people from all walks of life, from every nook and corner and cranny of Oxford. And so we are going to the people who may or may not be using services. It again, it really varies. But they're not coming at it with necessarily a professional lens. We ask them, and some, depending on who we're connected to, some might have all kinds of sort of professional hats or volunteer hats, but we ask them to leave their hats at the door and just speak as a citizen, as a resident, as a parent, as a community member.
Well, I think the thing that, and Harwood makes this really clear when you take the training, is you aren't going in to point fingers and blame. You aren't going in to say what is wrong with your community. It's not that kind of a conversation, which is why it starts with that sort of that big aspirational question of, we might live in a really wonderful community. How do we make it better, right? Because every community can improve, and new issues keep cropping up all the time that we need to find out, do they need to be addressed by people? So that's the one thing we really did like about it. It wasn't a what's wrong with this community. It's how do we make it better? And what would it take to make it better? And what gets in the way of making it better? Yeah.
And it's really better for all, because I mean, you made a point about you could see that the commonalities and the threads weaving through every group we spoke to.
Yep.
So whether it's a group of seniors, whether it's a group of newcomers to the community, whether it's a group from the agricultural sector, doesn't matter. There were all of these these common threads, and what was amazing to me is how quickly. Now, we were still learning, granted, in the beginning. After that, once we got the hang of it, how quickly those threads connected.
Yes.
And so, people fundamentally want the same kind of community. It might look a little different. What might matter the most to me might be a little different than what matters the most to you. So there's nuances. But generally speaking, we all want the same kind of thing for the community that we live in, and that we want to raise our families in, and we, that live, work, and play. And so I think that to me was a real aha moment, that we're not one-offs. This is really what people want, and what matters to them. And then where do we fit?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So we take once we have all of our conversations, and it's an ongoing thing. In fact, now that we've had a couple of years through COVID, and we know that certainly we have seen emerging needs, we've seen new needs in the community, and so we are about to be going out to re-engage in these conversations, certainly. But we know that when we gather this information, we can share it with our community partners. We can share it with what we call sort of the experts. Not only does that benefit us because we get their input and feedback, but the sharing benefits those organizations as well. And we know that a lot have used some of our learnings to influence the way they're delivering programs or services, etc. And I think it really does allow us, in the last session we talked about the 3 A's for Harwood, and it's authority, authenticity, and accountability. And this really is that authenticity piece that we know we can say, this reflects the community.
Yep.
And then we find our piece, the United Way's piece in that.
But you're absolutely right. What we hear are, some of them are things that we aren't in a position to do anything about. But again, based on our connections and our relationships with different groups, we're able to take that information, as you said, out to those groups and say, when you make your decisions, you need to consider this. This is what people are saying. And as you said, there are groups that have taken that to heart and said, yes, we will consider those kinds of things. So. And
people's perception is their reality.
It is.
And so I remember when we first started this, two things really stood in my mind out to me as I reflect back. One was we heard a great deal about belonging.
Belonging, yep. We were surprised by that.
We were gobsmacked, really, because it seemed hocusy pocusy, if you will, and then we kept thinking, like, why don't people understand we're United Way? Belonging's not our thing. Yeah. Like, we do other things. We do mental health. We do youth. We invest in youth mentoring. We do a lot of things. We don't do belonging. Like, what is until we realized that belonging is really foundational to people's happiness in their community, and it evolved to be belonging and acceptance and inclusion. And as we learned more, we realized that absolutely is us. That is part of our work as United Way, and things that we need to be very mindful of as we go forward.
So it's interesting, isn't it, Kelly? Because the very first conversations that we did, that belonging one, we struggled with even calling it a theme because it didn't have any concrete things behind it. But when we did further conversations, so we did the whole conversation with kids. Kids didn't call it belonging. They just wanted to be, and that was a big eye-opener for us. They didn't say, no, it's not the belonging piece, but I want to be accepted for who I am. And we thought, oh, that connects. And then when we did that last round of conversations pre-pandemic, people got even more detailed and just said, you know what? Yes, I want to belong, but I want ways to connect with other people. I want to find my group out there. And they all recognize the fact that this community, whether it's Tillsonburg or Woodstock or Ingersoll, it's changing. And these people basically are saying, look, we're changing. The opportunities to connect are getting a little harder than they were before. And, the comment that I think always resonated with me is, you know what, this is a small town feel. We don't want you to lose that, but there has to be a way to connect with other people. So we really found that interesting to see belonging morphed into accepting, into connecting with people. And again, that's a basic human need, isn't it?
It really
to connect
is.
at some level with somebody. Yeah.
It matters. It matters a lot.
Yeah.
And I just want to pick up on your comment about the youth. So, when we say that we've talked to people from all walks of life, from every corner of the county, one of the groups that we were actually very intentional, we went and spoke to kids in grade, I think it was 6, 7, 8.
And 9.
And it was a very specific project we were working on, and we wanted to learn some things that they would have to say. And at the first conversation was really like herding cats, and we thought, oh my,
this isn't going to go well.
But out of the mouth of babes,
Yep.
there was so many profound comments. You had to weed through them a little bit through the conversation, but really interesting insight and awareness into their environment.
Yep.
And their community. So
And their
not
community.
just their school environment, and that really wasn't the focus of the conversation, but the environment in which they live, and the community environment in which their family lives, how it impacts their families, whether their families are multi-generation Oxford families, or whether they're not, and what those connections look like. That was a really interesting part of this project work, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And it really became apparent that a lot of what they were saying still connected to our other conversations. So, for example, it's all fine and well to have activities out there. One, my parent can't afford that, or two, they can't get me to that. So there was an access transportation issue, which comes up all the time in our community, is access to services and getting to them and things like that. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. So at their own level, they were really identifying, as you said, the big community needs as well. It was just very specific to them. Yep.
And they really, I thought this was so interesting as well, because we spoke to kids in a variety of different schools. So it wasn't one neighborhood, it wasn't one school. We were all over the map, in Oxford. And from every school, from every environment, they had comments about who could afford,
Yes.
whether they could afford to be, and it doesn't matter whether it was gymnastics or swimming or dancing or hockey or any of the things, right? Art, music, you name it. But then they also really recognized who couldn't afford, and the kids themselves, there's 4 of us in the family, we can only do one thing, or my parents say we can't afford it. So that that access, that because we know transportation's an issue, so that piece and the affordability piece really became so apparent, and that mirrored so much of what we heard from the adults, in the year or two before that. When we talk about whether it was mental health supports or others, people talked about timely access, local access, and relationships. Like to be able to not have to tell, if they're looking for support and assistance, not to have to tell their story multiple times, but to actually have a relationship with someone so that they can deeply get the support that they need.
For.
Yeah. That was very interesting. So when we first started, Cheryl, I think from 2013 to about 2015, 16 or so, we had done, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of people we spoke to, but we spoke to a lot, and we heard a variety of comments.
We did.
And then maybe we could just talk a little bit about what we heard then, and then we could talk about how much deeper we've heard, what we've learned subsequently. So we've already mentioned belonging, and that was one that was really, I would say, overarching all of the conversations. That the importance of that and the barriers to belonging and the opportunities. And it really, there was even conversations within that about stigma and stereotyping and all kinds of things. We heard people talk about they wanted to have a voice. And another aspect of this work that I think was so rewarding is in almost every conversation we've had, and like I said, that's hundreds and hundreds of people, without fail, almost everyone thanks us.
Yeah, they do.
At the end, to say, we are so grateful that you included us, that somehow we went to them, because we don't ask them to come to us. We go to them. It's again, that's the difference, right? We want to be comfortable for them, and we want to engage and make that easy. But they thank us for including them and for asking them. And so many people said no one has ever asked them what matters to them, like from a community building perspective.
Yeah, there's always a reluctance when the conversation ends, right? They are reluctant to have it end because as you say, they are being heard, and they know they're being heard. And as I said before, the other part is we go back and we check in with them and say, did we hear correctly, right?
Yeah, and as we theme these pieces that we've heard, under wanting to have a voice and wanting to be heard, they really spoke about people in positions of authority, and not by name. This is again
just very generic.
Really. But
decision makers.
But decision makers do not always understand the ramifications of the decisions they make, and so, I mean, I think we all have experience where lots of things might look good on paper. We've seen this in our own worlds, in our own professions, etc. But when you roll it out on the ground, sometimes it doesn't quite roll out as well as you would think. And so they talked about about how maybe things are not the way they should be, and that they want to be able to influence change, that they want to have a voice that people listen to, the decision makers can hear, and that they could advocate for the kind of change that matters to them.
And they will hear it, because that's that authentic piece, right? So if a decision is made that is based on community conversations, the community hears it, and they know that, they might not agree with some of the details, but they know the decision was made based on what they heard, and that's powerful.
It really is. Yeah. And again, I think that tie into what those threads really were so common with all groups. So even if you weren't necessarily part of the equation and part of the conversations, it still resonates because it is what people believe, which I think is interesting. We also heard, at that high level in those first few years, a lot about wanting Oxford County to be a great place to raise children.
Raise children, yep.
Yeah, for children and youth to have the opportunities to grow up and to thrive and to engage in the kind of those opportunities, whether they're academic or learning supports, etc. They really want to know that their kids are safe and engaged and are valued and included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the interesting thing with that conversation, it morphed in a later conversation to include all those things still, but also to say that we want a community where youth will stay. They might go where they can go to higher education here, where they will stay and live and work in this community. Because of course, the longest time, youth were leaving because the opportunities were not necessarily here for some of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that really matters.
That really matters.
And we heard about basic needs, about poverty, and I'll remind people that this was a decade ago,
yes,
give or take. Mm-hmm. And so the conversation, we'll get to the next piece, how it's evolved since then. But basic needs, mental health, some of those things were, they weren't new by any means, but people were really beginning to talk about those issues related to the community and to the opportunities to help address those issues. Yep. And so maybe, Cheryl, you could talk a little bit about the next round and how we went a little deeper. One was with our youth conversation.
Yep.
And that was specifically here. That was targeted to Woodstock youth.
Woodstock, yep.
We had heard a lot about what might be some opportunities for youth. And we had said to one of the local service clubs who was interested at the time, I'll tell you what, how about we go ask them?
Yep.
Because they wanted us to say what could they do to benefit youth. And we felt that we needed to hear from them directly. Mm-hmm. And so we had amazing conversations with youth now these are high school youth. Mm-hmm. across Woodstock at all of the schools actually. And boy, did we learn a lot from them. Mm-hmm. So things like places and spaces, youth friendly, youth welcoming, accessible, free places and spaces.
Wanting to feel emotionally, physically safe was a big one. So these places and spaces, they needed to feel safe, accepted, and it wasn't suggesting that the places they went to weren't that way. It really, because interestingly enough, some of the places they named were not youth places. They were like a coffee place. Yeah.
Where the staff were nice to them and they were welcome.
You could sit there and nurse your one coffee for 2 hours and nobody chased you away. Like it wasn't necessarily youth-oriented activities. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they talked about places where they can hang out.
Yep.
And that, I always say, youth have been hanging out since since they were, hanging out at caves way back many, many, many moons ago. That's part of being a youth. You want to belong and you want to be with your group and you want Wi-Fi. So you want to hang out where there's Wi-Fi. We now know that Wi-Fi is incredibly important. And they also talked about wanting programs and opportunities, access. Yep. And so access might mean the transportation access or the time or the cost of the access. And they want to be able to explore and dabble and try things.
Try things out.
Which is
without a cost. Yep.
So fantastic, right? Mm-hmm. That, of course, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. They're on their learning journey as they're growing, and how fantastic if they can dabble.
And credit to a place like the Y, when they received some of this information. They were in the process of doing some of those things, but they really went deeper in some of these things. Now, unfortunately, the pandemic kind of put the kibosh on a lot of that, but they were one of the groups that took this to heart and said, hey, we could do that. And started to. And
absolutely. And really, building relationships. So that belonging, that relationship.
All that.
So again, the theme, it is the same theme, again, regardless of age.
Yep.
And so after we did that, and I'll just actually find it on the Woodstock youth piece, mentioned that as much as they wanted places and spaces, it was interesting when their conversations got to the point of, but where would those places and spaces be? Mm-hmm. There really was no commonality there, because I think part of the issue is Woodstock in particular is a larger city now, where access, as far as, you don't walk from one end of the community to the other necessarily. So there was no final answer there. There was a lot of discussion about how fantastic the Fusion Center is in Ingersoll, and how kids can walk to that, but they couldn't quite land on it here.
Right.
In Woodstock. So that's one piece. But that moved us into, so great learning there. We shared that broadly, and you mentioned a few of the organizations that really took some of that information and ran. So that was fantastic. And then we went deeper again.
We did.
And do you want to tell us maybe a little bit about what we heard in that next round?
Yeah. So we decided after a few years it was time to go back out and see where things were standing with our community. So we went and visited some old friends, groups that we had spoken to in the first round, but we also were able to look at the information that we gathered and our community itself and said, you know what, we need to involve some new friends. And so we visited a few new groups who had maybe different insights. So one of those would be sort of the rural population. Where are they at? Because we know that there are struggles and concerns amongst them. And we wanted to hear from that. So we really did involve more people in these conversations. But again, it didn't seem to matter who we spoke to. Those themes kept popping up. Some of the themes were very similar to the first round. Some themes just fell off the table. They weren't an issue for people anymore. And then there were some brand new ones that popped up that didn't show up the first time. So that's great learning for us. So for example, where we had sort of talked generally about mental health and addictions issues, and it was really kind of people just wanted better access to the services. Really what people were saying now is they want timely access, local access. They wanted consistent relationships. They were able to go in a much deeper way about what that actually would look like now. So when they talked about education and employment, they really wanted to create this community where people would want to live and work in Oxford County. So they wanted us to be that kind of a community. When they talked about poverty, we really found people getting very specific about what that was. It wasn't just about basic needs. They wanted affordable, safe housing for everyone. And I think anybody listening to this has already heard housing is an issue in everywhere, but in this community particularly. We need to plan how we're going to work with our aging population. So seniors became a new concern for people. And now I'm going to guess when we go out again, the pandemic has really highlighted that one, isolated seniors, and what are we going to do to make sure that their needs are being met?
Including the housing piece, specific to seniors. Yep. So the housing piece, and I mean, we could say this through sitting at various committees as well, but it runs the gamut now. It does. The whole continuum, because there are not a significant number of, say, one level, fully accessible and affordable housing opportunities as seniors are aging out of their own home. And where can they go?
And where can they go and stay in their community? That was sort of the big piece.
Yes.
So when we went talking to some of our smaller communities, people were reluctant to sell their homes because they couldn't stay.
And that's their home.
And that's their home. So seniors became a newer concern for people. And really, it wasn't just about having access to food. People were identifying, we want healthy food. We want to be able to access healthy food. We want a community that's rich with meaningful employment prospects. We want to attract and keep a workforce, including our young people. Those conversations talked about that whole voice piece. It wasn't just having a voice anymore. It was, you want authentic consultations. You want leaders at all levels, whether you're a church leader or whatever. It wasn't specific to any group. You just want leaders, people who are kind of leading the charge, to listen to us and kind of hear what we're asking them for.
And again, this was pre-pandemic.
This was
so
pre-pandemic,
I think this is really telling. I remember a couple of groups in particular talking about the changing dynamics in all of our communities, the changing needs and the wants, and how as communities we, especially the people, the decision makers, need to be thinking like a bigger community. We're not a small town community anymore. As a county, and the world around us is evolved, and people are moving here with different expectations, coming from communities that had different things that were being offered. And so, there was some real aha moments for me in those conversations about how can we do work differently? How can we engage community in more neighborhood-based opportunities that are accessible, and that wanting to be inspired, and the vision for the future as a common community, a common county. Very profound.
It was profound, and the bulk of the conversations would often land on that part. So it really was, as I started off a while ago saying, it started off with belonging, but it became connecting, and where are the opportunities to do that? And again, we go back to the pandemic. Boy, did it mess up those opportunities. So, but it's a chance also to move forward and say people are going to want it more. And how do we connect? How do we involve our diverse community? How do we make sure our seniors are involved, our youth are involved? So it's it's complex, but it is something that people are talking about. So I'm going to be curious to see how that has evolved over the last couple of years. They really do want a community which supports and accepts those with mental illness and addictions. And so it's all fine and well to say, I want my clean sidewalks, I want my community center, I want all that, but I also want a group of people who might be struggling in my community to have the supports that they need so that they can be the best that they can be. So that was a really heartfelt sentiment that came out, and it was nice to hear, to be honest.
It really was, and that speaks to, we often say here, it takes a village. But that was what we heard.
Yes.
We as a community, people who had the opportunity to talk with us, really want a healthy, vibrant, safe community for all. They want opportunities for all, not just themselves and their own, but for their neighbors, for their co-workers, for the people that are struggling. And that really resonated. And again, if it resonated then, it matters even more today.
Yep, even more. Yep.
And so just to maybe tie it all up with a big bow, when we use and hear all of that information, we did all of the theming, what does that mean to United Way? Like, how are we using that information above and beyond sharing with partners and others who are interested and want to learn, but we are using that information to direct our own investments and our work, correct?
Yes, yep, we are. So when we heard these conversations and did the whole theming process and talked to our experts and say, where do things fall here? Like, are there services that address this? And people just don't know about it. So we did all that work. And we said our strategies that we had been using since the first conversations, we looked at them and said, they're not the ones we need right now. So those strategies, just to remind you, are the things that we make our funding decisions based on. They really do identify the needs of the community that need to be addressed. And if you're an agency or an organization who can effectively address that, then we invite you to apply for United Way funding. So we looked at that and we said those strategies are outdated. If they don't reflect our community anymore, we need to redo those strategies.
We got to evolve.
We got a little team together and we looked at them, and the team involved community partners who came in, people who just were interested in the process. We worked away for a few evenings. we made some really good decisions, I believe. We got rid of some things and said, you know what, those groups are doing super job and employment. We aren't really going to fund anybody who's doing that kind of work.
Because good work is being done.
We don't
Absolutely.
need to do that anymore. So
Right.
we got rid of that. But then we brought in things around food access, and we started to rephrase those strategies and actually rewrite a lot of them as well, so that they totally impacted our community. And since then, we have had some interesting partners come to the table. So for example, we had the Food Forward program came forward and said, we want to try this. We think we can stop food waste. We have something, so that they were one as an example that we said we can fund. They wouldn't have fit in our previous strategies. So we are getting agencies and communities, or organizations, I should say, coming who do fit these new strategies and are doing impactful work in our community.
Yeah, and so it's how we've been able to identify some gaps. I mean, we're still doing some really great work funding organizations that have been partners for a long time, but we've identified these little gaps or these opportunities, the readiness really, like
And
where
the
there's a
readiness,
readiness to actually influence and change and to have hope for success, because that is obviously what we all want. And so those investment strategies have been narrowed, and I think over the coming year or two we will probably continue to narrow, because what set us on our journey, this journey to begin with, was we knew as a United Way here in Oxford County, we could not be all things to all people. We could not fund all programs and services. Wonderful programs, necessary programs and services, but we couldn't do it all.
No.
And so we're looking for where our best opportunity is, and where there is maybe a gap, where we can fill a necessary hole, if you will, to benefit the citizens here in our community, thanks to the generosity of the folks that donate to us. We want to use those dollars wisely.
We do.
To create the kind of change and hope and possibility.
Yeah. Well, that's back to those 3 A's. We want to be accountable. We want to be authentic and say we know and understand the needs of the community. We have pulled some partners together who can start to work on those things, and we can actually tell you where your money's going and the impact that it is having in our community. And that's pretty exciting.
That really is exciting, and really exciting days ahead as we just continue to learn and narrow, and that's part of this journey that is, I think, so rewarding, not just for us as staff, but for our volunteers.
Our volunteers,
and we
for
have
sure.
25 to 35 volunteers who are deeply committed to this work, in addition to our 50-member board. So it really matters. So Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us today to talk a little more about the community conversations and how that impacts our funding decisions and our work here in Oxford County. We really appreciate your perspective and your history, because it's been such an interesting journey. And so for our next episode, we are going to welcome Amanda Krager, who's our Resource Development Manager, to join us. And she is going to talk about our United Way Oxford fundraising and how we do that work. What the opportunities are there. We're going to learn about all of the different methods, as well as our community support and the incredible generosity of the people across Oxford County. And this really reinforces, I think, that when we say we are local, we are 100% local. All of the dollars raised here in Oxford County stay here in Oxford County. We invest them to serve citizens in Oxford County. So thank you, Cheryl, again.
My pleasure.
I'll just give a little shout out to Mike, who has helped guide and or force the podcast. And if anyone has any questions, please, you can reach out to Mike at unitedwayoxford.ca. He's been invaluable as we've gone down this journey. And once again, a thank you to Libro Credit Union for their incredible support of this podcast, but also their support for our community overall. They really do make a difference, and they show their local love every single day. And finally, thank everyone for joining us and listening in. And we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Local, Oxford. Take care. Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Local, Oxford. If you would like to learn more about United Way Oxford, our work, our engagement, our volunteer opportunities, our partners, or to even make a donation, please visit unitedwayoxford.ca or call our office. We love to chat, and we really love visitors too. If, however, you find yourself needing a hand to locate a program or a service, please call 211, our information and referral service. They're there to connect you to local supports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Remember, 211, they are there to help. Until next time, join with us by showing your local love. We all could use a little more of that. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Let's Talk Local Oxford, proudly sponsored by Woodstock Libro Credit Union.